because it's time to talk a bit of personal finance. We're away from the budget, but I'm sure we can touch on it too. Mary Holm is here to talk about buying a first home after the end of the First Homes grant scheme. Yes. Thank you for joining me in the studio here in Auckland, Mary.
It's a pleasure, Susanna.
Great to have your company. Well, we've just heard the budget from Finance Minister Nicola Willis. Anything come to mind?
Well, the sort of headline thing is the tax cuts, of course. And I was thinking as I was driving in, what I want to say to people is if you can possibly save that difference, if you can, have a look on apparently there's a calculator on the budget website where you can feed in your own data about your income, etc., and work out how much more money you will get out of the tax cuts, and there's some other changes in grants and things. And the trouble is saying, oh, hey, everybody save the extra you've got. I know a lot of people are really struggling out there, but at the same time, maybe they can save half the extra they get, or because it's amazing the difference that just saving, say, $20 a week added to your KiwiSaver or perhaps to an emergency fund. I mean, I keep hearing about a lot of people who don't have any kind of fund set aside for when things go wrong. And given that there's been a lot of talk of job losses recently, a huge help for people who have got some money set aside. So if you don't really have a decent kind of emergency fund, and people say, how much should that be? Well, look, anything from a few thousand to sort of 20 or 30,000. I mean, the more the better, really. So if people haven't got an emergency fund and they can put aside some of the extra money they'll be getting in their pockets, it looks like it's going to be from August on. The tax cuts take effect at the end of July, I think. So I'm just urging people to try not to just use it all to buy groceries, although I'd have to acknowledge some people really are struggling, and so they will need it for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you can, every little bit counts in terms of saving.
It really does, especially over lots of years. $20 a week over, I haven't got the numbers at the top of my head here, but they can really make a big difference to your KiwiSaver savings or something like that. And by the way, people can always just put in a little bit extra into KiwiSaver. You might be having money taken out of your pay at your job, but you can always also put extra money directly into KiwiSaver. Just ring up your provider or email your provider or set that up through a transfer from your bank into your KiwiSaver account over and above the money that's coming out in the workplace. And it can really build up over the years. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, and also just the feeling, coming back to your reference to having an emergency fund, just knowing that you've got something there, whatever the amount.
Yes, exactly. So for the emergency fund, of course, you wouldn't want to put it into KiwiSaver. If you're doing it for that reason, just put it in a bank savings account. Find an account that pays you reasonable interest. These days, the interest's not as bad as it used to be, and let it pile up there. And
Very good.
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the end of the First Homes grant scheme.
Yes, which the government announced just a week or two ago. And I was pretty disappointed to hear that. I mean, I think it's been a big attraction for younger people getting into KiwiSaver. I mean, telling young people that they'll have a better off retirement if they save in KiwiSaver is a bit distant for them, Not really something that's on the horizon, but possibly buying a first home is something that's a bit closer for people. And so I think it's really disappointing that money that a lot of people were going to be eligible for, getting extra money for their house deposit through KiwiSaver, is no longer available. But I have heard of some people saying, okay, I'm over it with KiwiSaver, I'm not going to bother now. I was hoping to buy a first home through KiwiSaver, and now this is, I'm missing out on the grant. I'm going to spend the money on something else. And that's a real pity, because it's still really worthwhile being in KiwiSaver and keep contributing to get the government money, and if you're an employee, the employer money. So, yeah. And I also just wanted to point out there are a couple of other ways you can still get help with the first home. Kaingora on their website there's a first home, it's called a first home loan with just a 5% deposit on your house. They don't give it, there are income limits and so on, but it's not like it's only available for really low income people. It's available for quite a lot of people. So I suggest people have a look at that, because having to raise a 5% deposit on a house is a heck of a lot easier than 10 or 20, which you otherwise might have to raise. So that's something to look at. And there's also quite a few people get help from their family, of course.
Yes,
and
the bank of mum and dad.
Yes, will presumably continue. The sad thing about that is it's rather unfair, because some people have got parents who can help and some have got parents who can't, or they haven't even got parents. But there you go, it is there for those who are lucky enough to get it. But the other thing I just wanted to talk to you about today is that if it's just all getting too hard to get a first home and the loss of this grant is really, taken the wind out of your sails, you can still set aside the idea of buying a home at some point in your life, but perhaps say, all right, I'm going to rent for the rest of my life. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing. I mean, in countries like Germany, Switzerland, I think Belgium, there's a few where I think more than half the people don't ever own their home. I might be wrong about that, but it's a big, big chunk of the population. And happily, they rent all the way through their lives, and they get long-term leases and decorate the place as if it were their own and all of that. And that's going to happen more and more in New Zealand, I think, because we're getting these, what they call build to rent, I think they're called, projects out there. So, yes, build to rent, where investors buy a unit within the building to rent out, and the idea is that they'll always be renters, and so they're going to encourage longer term leases, I think, which is going to make renting a lot more reasonable. The key thing, though, is if you rent for life, you really need to save more for retirement than you otherwise would if you had a mortgage-free home by retirement. So you've got to save really hard, so you've got a big chunk of money to go into retirement with to help cover your rent all the way through. So yeah, it's what I suggest people consider is, if you're renting and you've got friends on roughly the same income as you who own their house, ask them what they spend on rates, insurance, maintenance, all of those sort of costs of home ownership, and it'll usually be more than what you're paying in rent, usually. And so try and pretend that you've got to pay those extra bills and save the extra, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
To really try and boost your savings. Yeah.
Oh, that's good thinking. And also, if people have not been able to buy right now, the idea of just deferring the timing for that to another time, but keeping going and not losing hope.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, look, especially for younger people, the chances are quite good that house prices relative to incomes will go down between now and the time they retire, because they're ridiculously high in New Zealand at the moment. They're something like 7 or 8 times the average income is the average house price. And historically, it's been more like 3. And when you think about it, in the long run, the tendency's got to go back down, because it's just, the economics would suggest it's not as out of whack at the moment. I think we're the highest income to house price to income ratio in the world, or certainly one of them. So there's an awfully good chance that at some point house prices will fall relative to incomes, not necessarily absolutely fall. They have fallen recently, but that seems to be stopping. But, 10 years from now, I wouldn't be at all surprised if house prices are not as high relative to incomes as they are now. And so people who are saying, okay, I'm going to put off home ownership might be able to swoop back in again later, especially if they've saved plenty in the meantime,
Yes, well, this also, of course, opens up this question about where people, what do you advise in terms of long-term savings? Where do you advise people save that money?
Well, I think if it's for a home, it's a good idea to save in KiwiSaver because you can always get the money out to buy a home. Now, given what happened recently with the government taking away the KiwiSaver First Home Grant, you think, well, maybe they'll take away the right for people to take money out of KiwiSaver to buy a home. But I can't imagine that, partly because that doesn't come out of the government's coffers. This recent step where they've taken away the grants has saved the government money, which has enabled them to do other things with their budget. Whereas stopping you and me, people taking money from their KiwiSaver to buy a first home doesn't affect the government's money. And so I just cannot see a government ever doing that. And so I think that's a good place to keep saving for a home. It keeps your little sticky fingers off the money,
Yes.
You can't get it out to go on a holiday if you feel like it or whatever. So
KiwiSaver's number one. That's saving the long term for buying a house. What about if you just want to save long term? You've mentioned a bank and a savings account that pays well. Anything else that you can think of that you'd suggest?
Well, there are funds that are like KiwiSaver funds, but they're not within KiwiSaver. In fact, pretty much all the KiwiSaver providers have other funds that are very similar but outside KiwiSaver, tend to have slightly higher fees usually, which is something to avoid. But the advantage is that you can get the money out, and it is true that people don't always just access it for a holiday. They might access it because a family member needs big support. I mean, one of the disappointments in this budget has been that the government didn't give funding for some cancer drugs, that very expensive cancer drugs. And that's a sort of situation where a family member might suddenly need money spent on that, on getting drugs to get their cancer under control. And that's a sort of situation where having money outside KiwiSaver would help. I should hasten to add that if it were your money in KiwiSaver and you needed the drugs, you could probably get it out on a hardship withdrawal. But if it was a family member or a friend or something like that, you probably couldn't. And so it's good. That's something to think about. That's the advantage of being outside, saving in a fund that's outside KiwiSaver. Yes. Yeah.
And if people are receiving tax cuts as a result of what we've just heard this afternoon, just to recap on what you mentioned, what are some of the ways that people can redistribute some of that money without spending it, would you suggest? Like automatic payments, this kind of thing, in terms of a practical step?
Automatic payments are a really good idea. Out of the bank account that your pay is coming into, if you set up, let's say you get paid fortnightly on a Wednesday, set it up for the day after that, so fortnightly on a Thursday, you have money going from that account either into another bank account for your emergency fund, or directly into KiwiSaver, or into something else. It's a really good idea, that, because then you don't even think about it. After a while, it's just there. It's just happening. It's building up, and if it is money you've got from a tax cut, remember you're managing now without that money. If you're really not managing, if you really are building up debt, for example, to feed the children, well then obviously, of course, you're going to just keep the tax cut money to spend on feeding the children. But there'll be a lot of people who can manage without that extra money. Yeah.
Yeah, no, good advice. It's great speaking with you, Mary.
You too, Suzanne.
We covered everything. Yeah, you too. I've always listened, as I just mentioned before to you, I always listen to you, and I do so appreciate your perspective and your advice, and just how calm you are. It's a lovely thing to have, that, isn't it? Money conversations and calm is always a good combo.
And I'm a fan of your lovely voice on the radio.
Oh, thank you, Mary Holm. Well, that's Mary Holm.